Hello everyone and welcome back to our ongoing YouTube video series of lectures that you may have missed and or I went through too fast. We're going to talk about the French Revolution today. I'm going to be breaking it up into 3 parts because 1, I cannot talk for that long without a break. And there are kind of 3 waves to the French Revolution. And number 2, you don't want to hear me talk for that long. So this is just going to be part 1, the reign of King Louis XVI, all the way to his fall. Okay, so let's get started. First things first, I do want to make sure that you guys are always remembering to connect with the 4 biggest Enlightenment ideas that I stress in this class. This is not to say it's a comprehensive list, but these are the ones that I find to be the most important for utilizing in my class. And these are the ideas of natural rights, rights that belong to people simply because they're human. You breathe, you have rights, end of story. Rule of law. Officials make decisions based on written rules, not on personal beliefs or preferences or bias or any of those things. And the rules are supposed to be applied equally to all persons. Again, I can hear you right now. This is theory. This is in a perfect world. This is how we are supposed to have a society, right? So just hold that thought for right now. Consent of the governed, the permission of the people to rule. This is the permission of the people for the government to exist. And we give and we take permission, and we do that through active participation in our government structures, right? Because we don't just have rights, we also have responsibilities as citizens within our government, and as anybody, citizen or not, as participants in our society. Right? So that we can do that through activism, through community organizing. We can do that through voting, through contacting our officials, through a number of ways. And my personal favorite, the one that I think is the most understandable and applicable to understanding how societies work, social contract theory. This is the idea that people surrender their will. They do not give up their rights. People surrender their will by following rules and laws. And in exchange, the government is supposed to overall provide safety and stability to the people. And if the government does not do that, it is the right of the people to dissolve that government, right? And nowadays we do that dissolution through voting. So if you're unhappy with the current administration, register to vote. Time's ticking on registering, and go out and vote for a different representative. People who were upset by things that happened under Obama's presidency, they certainly went out and voted otherwise. Okay, so make sure you're utilizing your rights. Okay, so let's take some of these ideas and let's take a look at the French Revolution. Again, this is just a broad overview. This is not a detailed accounting of all the things that occurred. We're just looking for a fundamental understanding of the broad issues of the French Revolution. So basic causes of the French Revolution, this idea of bad harvests, having bad harvests, high prices on goods and on food, high taxes, unrest due to Enlightenment ideals, pin that one, we're going to really hone in on that one, and weak leadership. And whenever we are talking about any of these things in history class, it should not be a bland, you just tell me what happened and I'll memorize it and I'll answer some questions. We're going for understanding. And in order to understand something thoroughly, you need to connect with it in some way. You can connect with it because, you know, you can find comparisons to current events. You can connect with it because you can understand what people went through, right? And that's a practice in empathy. When you can empathize with people's points of view, you can understand it much more deeply. We're looking to, you know, find those connections to make things more interesting. And I would argue that makes the class more interesting when you can find connections. Okay, so here, bad harvests, right? So you have French society that has issues with their food supply. And one of the things that I say is a truism throughout history, hungry people do crazy things. And we're not talking about, you know, the kind of hangry y'all get when it's second block and it's right before lunch and it's 10:50 and you try to eat in my class and I say, no, no, you have to save that for lunchtime because I don't want bugs in my room, right? We're not talking about that kind of hangry where you just, your blood sugar dropped a little. We're talking about widespread malnutrition, okay? And you know, after a while, when people see their communities, when they see their neighbors, when they see their children not being able to eat, um, after a while, you just kind of don't care about respecting authority as much. Because if everyone around you is slowly starving to death, you know, what's the authority going to do to me? Things are pretty bad. How much worse can you make it? Right? So that's going to lead to a lot of unrest. People really get fed up when they do not have access to food and they really kind of don't feel held back by the, you know, rules of society at that point. You know, there are a lot of high prices on goods and especially food. So as we know, when we are talking about economics, when we are talking about capitalism, you know, if you have scarcity of an item, that's going to lead to increased prices, especially if that item is in high demand. We all have to eat. So when food is scarce and it is a necessity, then that means that the food that is there is going to be very, very, very expensive. And that's a problem when you have high amounts of poverty as well. Okay, so if I am not making very much as a worker and I have to, here's the third one, pay high taxes, right? The money I'm making is already not enough. Now the government's going to come and take a chunk of it, and now I have even less, right? And then high prices, and now the money I do have doesn't go very far and is inadequate. So it really just puts this pressure on society to the point where it becomes like, you know, a pressure cooker where it just keeps building and building and building. And I'm talking the old school pressure cookers, the ones that go on the stove, the ones that scare you because, you know, if you've ever seen one of those, you never know when they're going to explode. Okay. Weak leadership. When you have weak leadership, when you have, you know, people in power who are not responsive to the needs of the people, they're going to feel tight, right? And understandably so. So that weak leadership leads to a lot of unrest as well. It keeps packing in more pressure in that pressure cooker. And, you know, Enlightenment ideals, we talk about the Enlightenment, and it's not like these are new ideas that people came up with. It's just a time in which people paired these thoughts and feelings with the scientific revolution and applied it to society and trying to figure out their analysis of society. People have always had a sense of natural rights. Nobody has ever thought that it's like if I walk down the street and somebody, you know, beats the crap out of me, nobody thinks that's okay. You know, this is not a new thought. That has always been true. You know, people have always had a sense of what's fair from their government, what's equitable from their government. But, you know, with the Enlightenment, people were pairing that with this idea of scientific equality, biological equality, this idea that, you know, we should all have access to certain minimum standards and rights. And people really start to feel very unhappy and unaccepting of the status quo. People are no longer willing to just simply say, well, I suffer now, but, you know, I'll go to heaven and live life in eternal bliss, you know, for all of eternity. People aren't really buying that anymore. And they're really kind of questioning, like, why do I have to suffer now in order to get into heaven? Okay. So let's talk about the social stratification within France, okay? And those are the three estates. So you have these three social classes. that forms the structure of society in France at this time. You have the first estate, which is very privileged, right? It's a Roman Catholic Church. They own 10% of the land, but they only pay 2% tax rate. That's incredibly low. I pay 25. But even though people might get upset at the Roman Catholic Church, wait, they do provide education. They do provide relief to the poor. They marry you, they bury you. If you're sick or hungry, you might be able to get some assistance from the church. So even though you might be angry at the privilege that they get, they do kind of help you out sometimes too. So you don't want to bite the hand that feeds you, because it does feed you on occasion. Okay. The second estate are the rich nobles. They're 2% of the population, but they own 20% of the land. But they pay next to nothing in taxes. Again, this should all sound very, very familiar. You should be making connections to current events, to current day. Okay. So those rich nobles, they have a lot of power. They have a lot of influence. And they're able to accumulate lots of wealth because their wealth is not being redistributed in taxes. They are not having to pay a lot of money to the government. So they're able to hoard their wealth. The last estate is the third estate, and they are not privileged. It's 97% of the people. And this is not to say that everybody in the third estate was dirt poor and poverty-stricken peasants. They weren't. You had different social classes within the third estate. You had very, very, very wealthy, very educated merchants. And then you did have a lot of very, very poor peasants. And they pay very high taxes. Okay, much higher taxes than the second estate or the first estate. So privilege is something that it's a word that's used a lot in our society today. And privilege does not mean that you never go through anything. It doesn't mean that you never struggle. It doesn't mean that, everything is just perfect for you all the time. Privilege means that you have advantages. And especially that the system is set up to give you advantages if you belong to a privileged group. So just being a noble, the way the system is set up, the taxation system, you don't pay as much money if you're a noble. That's a privilege. The Roman Catholic Church, you don't pay as much money if you, are the Roman Catholic Church. Okay, but if you're the third estate, you're paying a lot of money in taxes. Okay. So the third estate complaints, right? You have the bourgeoisie, right? That should sound very familiar to you guys. You guys like to throw around the term bougie. Where do you think it comes from, right? So the bourgeoisie is the middle class. They're very highly educated. And through that education, they've read a lot of these Enlightenment ideals. They have taken these ideas of the scientific revolution and they're looking at society and saying, well, does it have to be this way? And why is it this way? And, we don't really need to stay there, do we? And the bourgeoisie really resent being looked down on by the nobles, and they really resent paying higher taxes than the nobles. The nobles, they are born in, those families are born into privilege. Okay, but you also have the bourgeoisie who sometimes have more wealth than nobles. They have more education than some of the nobles, but they don't have any of the privilege. And, the bourgeoisie feels some type of way about that. You have workers who are like today's blue collar workers. They might be tradespeople, they might be laborers. They're not paid very much. They're frequently unemployed. And if you don't have money, you're not eating. Okay. Most of the third estate, though, is the peasantry, right? 80% of the third estate is the peasantry. And for peasants, half their income went to taxes. So if I had to work all day for $1, made up number, but just for easy reference, if I have to work all day for $1, and that dollar is not enough to do anything for my family, the government's going to come along and take 50 cents. The dollar wasn't enough. What am I going to do with the 50 cents that you left me? Right? So people get very fed up and upset with that situation. So the estates have, a general meeting. And the third estate wants a more representative government system in this meeting. The third estate wants every single delegate to have a vote. So the third estate had very many people, so they had very many delegates. It kind of works like the House of Representatives that way. And the king doesn't want to do that because the way the system is set up, every estate has the same number of representatives, like our US Senate. So the first estate has a certain number, the second estate has a certain number, and the third estate has a certain number, which means each estate has equal power. But of course, the first and second are privileged. They're always going to team up and create a system that benefits themselves. And the third estate wants to change that. If every delegate had a vote, not every estate, but every delegate, every person present at these meetings had a vote, the third estate would have incredible power. So here's truism number 2 in history. Nobody wants to give up their power. So the king refused those changes, right? People are very resistant to giving up their power. Again, if you are not making connections to today, you need to start watching the news, the national news, okay? So the king actually, during a break, closes the door of the meeting room, closes the doors, and locks the doors, and locks out the third estate. Locking someone out of a room is not going to stop them from anything. So the third estate decided to go meet separately somewhere else. And so the only space, well, the space they found that was big enough to hold all of their membership, all of their delegates, was a tennis court. So this is where you get the tennis court oath from. So the third estate decides, to hell with the king, we're going to draft a new constitution. He's not going to share any of his power. He's not going to give us any sort of voice. Well, then we're just going to take it then instead. And they formed the National Assembly. Anybody whose power and authority is challenged, of course, is going to respond to that. And so while you have this National Assembly being created, people are very afraid of what the king's response to that is going to be. And people are afraid of a military crackdown. And these rumors start to fly around Paris that the king's going to bring in troops, right? And he's going to make sure that nobody can take power. And in anticipation of that, people begin to gather weapons because they're expecting troops to be coming through their neighborhoods. And they're fed up. They're not having it anymore. So on July 14th, 1789, the Parisians stormed the Bastille. And the Bastille is a prison that was, it's no longer there, but that was in Paris. And that prison was basically like a mini castle in the middle of the city. So when the Parisians stormed the Bastille, it was not primarily to free the political prisoners that were there. I think there were only 5 or 6 individuals in the prison at the time. The real reason people stormed the Bastille is because they kept a lot of weapons there. They wanted arms. Those people wanted arms. So if the king is coming into my neighborhood, right, with the military, I'm going to need some sort of weaponry to defend myself. But this turns into a cycle that goes on and on. This leads to the Great Fear, because if you thought the king was going to react to a meeting with the military, how is he going to react to people storming a prison and taking weapons? So this grows exponentially. People become very afraid that the king is really going to respond very violently. And this panic rolls through France, right? And mobs of people are just done. The pressure cooker, the lid is being blown off the top of the pressure cooker. And mobs of people start to rise up and they start storming the nobles' houses and start burning the nobles' houses. Now, these people aren't dumb, okay? A lot of peasants in France and a lot of people in the third estate live with a lot of debt, right? So right now, I have student loans. If I burn my bill, the paper copy of my bill for my student loans, does that make my debt go away? No, of course not, right? That's kept on a computer, that's kept on servers. There are multiple copies everywhere. There's no dodging that student loan debt, let me tell you, right? Burning the bill isn't going to do anything. But back then, debts were written and people signed for them. And so you could have debts being bought and sold amongst nobles and amongst people who were in power because the debt was that sheet of paper. So if you could get rid of that sheet of paper, if you could get rid of that proof of your debt, you don't owe anything anymore, right? So people were smart. When they're burning down the houses, they made damn sure that they stopped off and they burned the proofs of debt. Okay? So this is liberty leading the people, and you can see a little bit of the French Revolution there. I have some more information on there on the Jupiter pod. So what are the results? What are the major results of this first installment of the revolution? Well, we end up with a limited monarchy, right? The king is the executive, and much like our executive branch, then the king is going to be enforcing the laws. And the legislative assembly is just that. They legislate, they write the laws. So the king is no longer the interpreter of the laws, the enforcer of the laws, and the writer of the laws. Power has been taken away. Okay, the slogan of liberté, égalité, fraternité is everywhere in Paris. If you go to Paris, you'll see it on all of the government buildings in the various arrondissements, right? And this is the slogan of the assembly: liberty, equality, fraternity, freedom, being equal, and fraternity being this idea of brotherhood, which is problematic because if you're saying fraternity like that and you're saying brotherhood, who is being left out, right? And they create the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. And this is based on Enlightenment ideas. And the revolution also creates a state-controlled church. And that is where we're going to stop it for today. That is phase 1 of the French Revolution. So I will next be recording and posting videos this weekend towards the end. I will try. There are plenty of resources in your pod to be able to complete the pod, but I will be talking about the Jacobins in part 2. In part 3, we'll be talking about Napoleon and his horrendous mistakes of leadership. Okay.